Almost everyone ends up in the same place after that cut to black. You sit there for a second, and then you start asking who did it. Well, actually, first you're thinking, what the fuck just happened? But, I mean, after you process it, you're probably asking yourself who did it. Most people make up their minds about whether he died fairly quickly, one way or the other, and then they spend years on the question of who. The show never answers it, obviously. But there's a version of the answer that's stuck around for 20 years, and the reason it's stuck around is that it does something no other theory manages. It explains who still wanted Tony dead after the war was over, and it explains the part nobody else can explain, which is how anyone knew he'd be sitting in a diner in Bloomfield on a Sunday evening with his family. The three names that come up are Paulie, Patsy, and Butchie. There's no scene where they plan it, but this show almost never does betrayal cleanly. Tony gets Phil killed without anybody ever saying the words out loud, so if this happened, it happened the same way. Here's the part that actually interests me though, and it took me a while to see it. If any of this is true, Tony spent his entire life watching the wrong men. He worried about Christopher, Ralph, Richie, and Pussy, the loud ones who drank and made scenes. And the people who might have finally got him were the quiet ones sitting at the edge of the room, the ones he humiliated so thoroughly that he stopped bothering to look at them. Start with Patsy, because his reason goes back the furthest. Patsy works for Tony because Tony had his twin brother killed. That's the whole foundation of the relationship. Philly was talking too much, including about Tony seeing a psychiatrist, and Tony decided he was a liability. Gigi shot him in a car. Then Junior's crew got folded in, and Patsy ended up reporting every single day to the man who ordered it, and he knows. That's the part I think gets forgotten. Silvio tells Tony in the season 3 premiere that Patsy's been drinking and talking about men who smile in your face while being villains underneath, and that he's been saying he knows who did it. Silvio even says out loud how hard that must be, coming to work every morning and looking Tony in the eye and pretending. So Patsy shows up at Tony's house with a gun and watches him through the window and starts crying, then lowers it, urinates in Tony's pool, and goes home. I find that scene almost unbearable to watch now. It's the closest he ever gets, and what he does instead is the smallest, most pathetic act of defiance available to a man in his position. He violates something private and meaningless, then walks away, and neither of them ever mentions it again. After that, he becomes one of the most reliable soldiers Tony has. He frightens Gloria when Tony needs it done. He handles collections. He survives every shift in leadership by never once being interesting enough to remove. Which means the guy standing quietly in the background of half this show has been carrying his brother's murder for years, and nobody has ever given him a single thing that resembles closure. Then the last season changes his position completely. Meadow is with Patsy's son Patrick, seriously enough that both families are talking about marriage. Tony brings it up himself when he's leaning on Paulie to take Ralph's old crew, that Patsy's about to be family, and that cuts both ways harder than people give it credit for. On one side, it's the best thing that ever happened to him. His son marries the boss's daughter. His grandchildren would be Tony's grandchildren. Tony suddenly has a personal reason to keep Patsy's family safe. On the other side, Tony now owns him completely. Patsy can't have a problem with Tony anymore without it landing on his son's marriage and his family's whole future. And then Jason happens. Carlo's son gets arrested selling ecstasy. Carlo disappears not long after, and Tony and Paulie work out he's talking to the government. The man who first tells Tony about that arrest is Patsy. The problem is that Patsy's own son, also called Jason, runs with Carlo's kid in the same circle, doing the same gambling, mixed up in the same things. If that investigation keeps pulling, Patsy's son is on the other end of the rope. Tony sees it instantly, and that dinner in the finale is him testing it. He asks where Patsy's other son is. He brings up the arrest. He points straight at the friendship between the two boys. The table goes quiet. Patsy's wife says something about not thinking Jason was invited, and somebody steers it toward lawyers in Meadows' career. Tony is doing more than making dinner talk there. Carlo flipped after his son got arrested. Patsy's son is in the same position, and Tony is sitting at his own dinner table doing arithmetic about whether Patsy is next. And Patsy is sitting across from him watching him do it. He knows exactly what Tony does with people who become risks, because he's watched it happen to Philly for gossip, Pussy for informing, Adriana for cooperating, and Bert for talking to New York. He has no idea how far this investigation reaches or what his son would say in a room with federal agents. All he knows is that the man who killed his brother is looking at him differently. That's a completely different motive than revenge. That's a father who might need Tony gone before Tony decides the same thing about him. Before we go further, though, there's a serious problem with all of this, and it needs saying properly. During the war, Patsy is standing right next to Silvio outside the Bing when New York shooters open up. He returns fire and gets into the woods and barely makes it out. Those bullets were aimed at him, too. If he had an arrangement with New York, that's a spectacularly stupid way to run it. It gets worse. When New Jersey tries to kill Phil, the order goes down a chain, Bobby to Paulie to Patsy to Corky to the two Italians. Patsy is inside the command chain trying to kill New York's boss. So is Paulie, who publicly takes the blame when it fails. and New York's own list rules him out. In the beauty shop, someone asks about Paulie and Butchie says, no, management. Then he names Tony, Silvio, and Bobby. Patsy doesn't even come up. So during the war, neither man was working for New York. I think that's fairly settled, which means if any of this happened, it happened afterward, and by then, everything is different. Bobby's dead, Silvio is never waking up, Carlo is talking, Tony's facing an indictment, and New York has proven it can reach anyone in New Jersey it feels like reaching. For the first time since his brother died, Patsy has somewhere else to go, and that somewhere is Butchie, who's the man I'm most confident about in all of this. He spends the final season pushing New York toward war, and he says why in one line in that beauty shop.
They got redundant upper management, bleeds off half the kick. We take them out, absorb the whole fucking thing.
Phil calls it decapitation, doing business with whatever survives. That's the plan. Kill the top three, take the money, work with whoever's left standing. Then it falls apart. Bobby dies, and Silvio ends up in a coma, and Tony survives. New Jersey's attempt on Phil kills a woman and her elderly father instead. Phil vanishes, and Butchie is left running a war with no boss, no instructions, and no way to end it. Then comes the phone call, which I think might be the most overlooked scene in the finale. Butchie carefully raises the idea of talking to Tony. Phil turns on him immediately, accuses him of wanting to back down, and tells him they'll discuss it privately once this is over. Butchie says he hopes so. Phil says the connection's breaking up and hangs up without ever taking the threat back. Sit with what that means for a second. Butchie could win this entire war and still get killed for suggesting peace during it. His own boss just told him so on the phone, so he arranges a sit-down, and Paulie is in the room for it. Butchie says New York will back off. Tony says his price is help finding Phil, and Butchie says, I can't go there, but you do what you gotta do. That's a man ordering a hit on his own boss without one incriminating word, and Tony reads it perfectly. Phil dies at a gas station in front of his wife and grandchildren with his own car rolling over his head. Butchie's problem is solved, and he gets New York out of it. But look at what he's holding now. Tony knows he sold out his own boss. That's permanent, and Butchie has to sit across from him at every negotiation from here on, knowing Tony can say it out loud whenever it suits him. Tony is also the last obstacle to the original plan. 2 of the 3 are already gone. The entire war was about absorbing New Jersey's construction money, and he's the only thing still standing in front of it. And Phil's people need managing. Their boss was murdered in the street in front of his family, and the man who arranged it is now running the family. Handing them Tony solves that too. So he keeps the truce, lets Tony do the messy part, and finishes the plan a few weeks later. In his own head, that's just the deal working exactly as designed, which leaves Paulie, and Paulie is the part people exaggerate most. He's sold out New Jersey before, and that's documented. Season 4, feeling ignored, he starts talking to Johnny Sack and passing along family business, including Ralph's joke about Ginny. That leak nearly gets Ralph killed and almost starts a war years early. His own crew works out someone's currying favor across the river. They even suspect Patsy first because of the grudge. It's Paulie, and Johnny plays him beautifully, telling him Carmine asks about him, letting him picture a version of his life where New York values what New Jersey doesn't. Then Paulie finally walks up to Carmine at a wedding, and Carmine has no idea who he is. The betrayal failed, and the willingness is what matters, because Paulie was ready to damage his own family over feeling unappreciated. And Tony works it out eventually. In Florida, he keeps circling back to the Ginny joke, and Paulie keeps denying it. Then Tony takes him out on a fishing boat, alone, on open water, and pushes again, staging something that looks exactly like the day they killed Pussy. Paulie can feel it happening. Tony seriously considers it and decides against it because he can't get certainty. But Paulie steps off that boat knowing his boss thought about killing him out there. That trip also finishes whatever was left between them. Paulie treats Tony like the son of a man he genuinely loved. Tony tells him remember when is the lowest form of conversation and makes fun of the stories that are basically the whole content of Paulie's personality. Then the war comes and New York leaves him off the list. The show gives a reason for it right there in the scene, that he's below management level. Taken alone, it means very little. What Paulie learns from it is that New York has decided he's worth keeping alive. Which brings us to the scissors. Immediately after the sit-down where Butchie greenlights Phil's death, Paulie walks into the Bing offering everyone barber's scissors. New York planned the entire war inside a beauty shop. On its own, that's nothing. Paulie sells stolen merchandise constantly and always has. It only gets interesting sitting next to everything else, and I wouldn't build a case on it. The last conversation matters more. Tony offers him Ralph's old crew. Paulie says no, because everyone who's ever run it has died, and Paulie is superstitious enough to take that as a pattern. Tony gets angry and says he'll give it to Patsy instead, and mentions Patsy's about to be family. Paulie accepts on the spot. The simple reading is jealousy, and honestly that's probably all it is. He can't stand Patsy getting above him. The other reading is that he knows what's coming and wants to be holding New Jersey's construction business when it lands. Either way, look at what that arrangement produces. Paulie runs construction. Patsy gets family protection and a promotion in reach. Butchie gets a week in New Jersey he can do business with. And nobody had to be told anything. That's the level of involvement that actually fits him. Paulie is impulsive, superstitious, and constitutionally incapable of shutting up. And running an operation that involved New York, Patsy and Tony's family movements would take a discipline he has never once shown. Saying nothing while other men arrange, it takes almost none. So here's how the whole thing works without anyone sitting down together. Butchie decides Tony's outlived his usefulness and puts word out through channels that already exist, because New York has been recruiting Jersey guys for months. Silvio said so himself before he got shot, that they were squeezing people hard to sway them toward new management, and that they'd assumed Silvio would be part of it. Paulie doesn't agree to anything. He just doesn't warn anybody, and lets New York know business continues afterward. And Patsy supplies the one thing nobody else can, which is where Tony's going to be. Meadow mentions dinner to Patrick. Patrick mentions it at home. Patsy passes it along. Patrick never knows what his father did with it, and Meadow walks into that restaurant thinking she's just late. There's no scene showing that. It's just the cleanest available answer to a question the show leaves wide open. It also explains Holsten specifically. Nobody attacks a room full of armed men. Tony's relaxed, unguarded, surrounded by civilians, and distracted by his own family arriving one at a time. The bathroom is behind him. His attention is on the door. Which brings us to the man in the members-only jacket, because any theory about who arranged this has to say something about the only person in that diner the show actually draws your attention to. He comes in ahead of AJ. He looks at the Soprano table twice. He sits at the counter with his back to them, and then a few minutes later he gets up, walks past Tony, and goes into the bathroom. He's the one patron who makes eye contact. The credits list him as man in members-only jacket, which for a background extra is a strange amount of specificity, and the jacket itself is doing something. The first episode of the final season is called Members Only, and it's the episode where Eugene wears one. It's also the episode where Eugene, wearing that jacket, walks into a diner and shoots a heavy-set man who's sitting there eating. That man's name is Teddy Spiridakis. His initials are TS. Then Eugene asks Tony to let him retire to Florida. Tony says no, and Eugene hangs himself in his basement, and his wife, before that happens, tells him to put a bullet in Tony's head. I'd stop short of saying the man in the diner is related to Eugene, because the show never says so, and the resemblance is the kind of thing people find because they're looking. What I'd say is that the jacket is deliberate, and that whatever it's pointing at somebody Tony ruined, which fits the rest of this exactly. The man in the jacket would be the instrument. He still has to be told where to go. Somebody has to know that Tony Soprano is eating onion rings in Bloomfield on a Sunday, and the man walking through that door isn't the person who knew it. That's the part the theory is actually trying to answer. So those are the arguments for it. Here's everything that argues against. Butchie gave his word in a sit-down brokered by a neutral party in front of witnesses, and breaking that is a real thing in their world. Patsy took fire during the war and was in the chain of command trying to kill Phil. So was Paulie, who took the blame publicly when it failed. Paulie's exclusion from the list has a stated reason on screen. The scissors are probably just scissors. And there's no scene, none at all, of Patrick telling his father anything about Holsten's. Chase has never confirmed any of it either. In the 2024 documentary, he pointed back to a Season 3 scene where AJ says he thought black meant death, and said the finale's visual language was built around that exchange, which is about as close as he's ever come to confirming Tony dies. He's never said who, and he said more than once that whether Tony is alive isn't the point. Although Chase has said his original ending, the one he abandoned, had Tony killed coming back from a meeting in New York. He didn't use it, but the version of the story where New York finishes him was in his head at some stage. So what do I actually think? Butchie, I'd put real weight on. He has the authority and the motive and the opportunity. The whole war was about absorbing New Jersey. He only stopped it when Phil became a personal danger to him. Used Tony to remove Phil, and came out of it with every reason to finish what he'd started. Patsy is a solid maybe. Tony killed his twin, made him live beside it for years, and then spent the last dinner of the series openly working out whether Patsy's son was about to put them all in prison. And Patrick's relationship gives him access to Tony's movements that literally nobody else in that organization has. Paulie is the least convincing mastermind and the most convincing bystander. He betrayed Tony before. He knows Tony thought about killing him on that boat. New York deliberately spared him. And he ends the series running the exact business New York wanted all along. None of them would need to trust each other. They'd only need to arrive at the same conclusion separately, which is that Tony had become more dangerous to them than he was useful. And that's what I keep coming back to. Patsy learned to smile at the man who killed his brother. Paulie learned that 30 years of loyalty means nothing the week your boss gets tired of you. Butchie learned that a war can remove 2 bosses instead of 1. Tony spent 6 seasons watching the loud ones. He never once worried about the men sitting quietly at the edge of the room because he'd already broken them and there was nothing left in them worth watching. He walks into Holsten's thinking it's over.